Hey, what's up everyone? Thanks for tuning in today. Today's video is going to showcase the Mark 50 helmet, the one from Infinity War. Basically in this video we're going to show you some pretty essential steps into showing how to get your prints or helmets, whatever you're working on, nice and smooth. The helmet was printed in 3 parts, so we are going to show you how to properly merge your PLA pieces together. How to use body filler properly, glazing putty, and lastly filler primer. So I'm going to kind of incorporate all the steps, break it down, show you how to get those prints nice and smooth, and prep your helmet for paint and get it looking as movie quality and as great as we possibly can. So without any further ado, here's part 1 of the Mark 50 helmet build. Let's go. Alright, so here we are at stage 1, or opening stage, opening credits, whatever you want to call it, for the Mark 50. So we had a couple of fitment issues with this. I'll kind of show you when I put the faceplate on. This was a print where I paused the print involuntarily. My son decided to hit pause, and it resumed, but it created this line, so I was having some fitment issues with some of the stuff, so I had to go in and kind of cut some of these things. Pretty much got it back to where we need it though. Obviously we used 2 different colored filaments. This back piece, I was able to sand most of that down, but you can see that the helmet itself is not fully sanded. So the first step in this is getting this smoothed out. So I'm gonna hit this with 80 and 160 grit just to kind of get it mostly smooth. You can see I've started, but a long way to go. I've cleaned up a lot of those little minor imperfections in here, but essentially the first step in this is going to be to get this whole thing sanded down, knock down some of these lines here, and then start applying the glazing putty. So let me see if I can do this here. Face plates. Should have brought my tripod here, but I didn't. Okay, so you can see that everything lines up pretty good, fits pretty good. The only place where I have an issue is you can see here, it's nice and contoured, and then here where that reprint was, it's a little bit tight. So I've got to knock down just around this cheek here, just a little bit more, and then I have to fill in that gap right there. But other than that, it's not too bad. Everything lines up really good. Looks pretty clean. So what I'm gonna do is just do a general firm sanding of all this, try to get rid of these lines, glaze it. In here, we're gonna need body filler. When you use glazing putty, that's just for very, very small imperfections. This is something where there's a decent gap and it needs to be filled in. So the helmet has been just a basic weld together. You can see some of those welds area that I used. I'll do more of those and I'll show what I used. I've used it in the past. It's the Rapid Fix. But essentially just a lot of sanding, but I wanted to show you the helmet before we get too deep into putting some sanding effort and the glazing putty and the body filler. So yeah, so this is just opening stages. We'll get this thing sanded and follow up and see how it's looking. All right, so just a little update on the Mark 50 here. So what I've done is I put body filler and hid that line that's there from the 2 pieces. I've also narrowed this gap down better. It still needs a little bit more. That's why I haven't gone crazy and sanded that in there. It needs to come out a little bit more. But my method when I do these helmets is I don't go crazy with sanding all this. I'm probably just gonna do a light 220 sand on the remaining part of this helmet and then go right to glazing putty. This stuff just takes forever to sand. This does not, and this will fill in all these minor imperfections. That is really what glazing putty is made for, is to fill in minor imperfections, very, very minimal ones. You know, when you have something heavy with a gap, you want to use body filler, but body filler takes forever to sand. This stuff is nothing. I used 220 over this, and it knocks it down right away. So, you know, really, if you can do a glazing putty on this, you know, maybe just do a 220 sand on this, maybe a 160, 180, but then essentially just do the whole helmet, whatever you're doing in glazing putty. Go over all these little intricate areas with a plastic razor blade because you don't want to fill those in. And then just sand it, see how it looks, and then filler primer. Do 1 or 2 coats of filler primer. Again, this is really the best method that I've found anyways to get all these imperfections gone at a quicker time. People who sand and sand, I mean, this just takes forever to sand, and you're not going to get rid of all of them just sanding that. You've got to fill them in. It's the easiest way to do it. So that's what I'm doing here. What I'm actually going to do though now is just throw just some standard filler or some standard primer on here just to see how my gap is. I want to make sure it's filled, and it's kind of hard to see without it being one color and then the red mixed in there. So I just throw some primer right over these areas here just to make sure everything's looking contoured. I know there's going to be some little pinholes and stuff. That's okay. I'll go through, resand those, and then fill those in with the glazing putty. But I want to see how all my lines are looking. So that's how it's looking. I've got the whole faceplate. I just glazed it, so I'm going to have to sand that in a bit here. But we're just going to throw some primer on this and see how it looks. All right, a little update here. You may hear some background noises because my son is outside, and he is enjoying the swing set on this lovely fall. I think it's officially fall now. I think at like 10:30 it changed to fall. But basically what I did is the areas that were not filled with body filler, I went through and put glazing putty on. This is going to be the quickest way to get your prints smooth. A lot of people, they try to sand the PLA, and they sand and sand and sand and sand. One, that will take definition and integrity out of your print, and two, it takes way too long. Glazing putty, you can just knock it down with 220 or 320, and it doesn't really affect anything. It won't take away hard body lines or anything like that. It comes off super easy. You can actually, what I do is when I put it on, I just take a plastic razor blade and just scrape it out, and then just fold some sandpaper and just go over these lines, and it takes it right out. So that's what I've done with all of the areas here that you see with the red. I tried some wood filler, and it was terrible. Not a fan. It's like body filler, but worse. It's really, really aggressive, or I should say really, really coarse, and you have to get really aggressive with it to get it off, so you pretty much end up taking off everything, and it just is a waste of time. So I have to glaze back over this. But you can see I got a lot of the helmet done. Back here, I just have to scuff this down and then glaze all this back area. I took a little bit of primer and just primered it just to see how the spots were. I like to just do just a basic coat of primer just to see what spots are, if I have any high spots or low spots, areas that I need to fill in or not. All through here, I'm going to try to clean all this up. I'm just going to put some glazing putty over it and then just try to create new lines. You can see I've got some gaps here. So I'm just going to fill it in with some glazing putty, create some new body lines. This back piece is pretty good. This needs another layer. I'll probably actually sand that down a little bit more and just go filler because they're pretty heavy blemishes there. That's going to need some filler right there. But overall, I mean, the piece is now one, it's uniform. And I haven't even really done more welding. I will, just to hold this together a little bit better, but it's very structurally sound. I don't know what shaking it is going to prove, but I'm going to keep shaking it to show you how firm it is. But yeah, I got to do another round of glazing here, and then everything will be sanded. At that point, I can start doing some filler primer and more sanding. So, and we've got our commentary in the back. Some comments from the peanut gallery. So I'm gonna scuff this down a little bit more, and then put some filler glazing putty on. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Do some more glazing putty, and then just do more sanding. So on to the next. All right, so here is the mask after sanding. I didn't screw around with this one. I went right to 80 grit and then followed with 160 and 220. It's pretty smooth. This was just a really quick sand. This honestly took me maybe 10 minutes. You can clearly see that I did not get in all of the areas, but the only reason I do this for is just to make sure everything's looking pretty uniform. So do a quick sand on this, and then what I'll do is I'll primer this, and then I'll go back and look and see. Most of these areas I can see, but there's gonna be some other areas that are gonna pop out more, and I'll go back and sand those with a 220 and a 320. Up here is gonna need a lot of work, but it's gonna be really, really smooth once I get all that cleaned out. So this really is the quickest way to get your prints smooth. So I'm gonna spot check a couple of these with some 320 and then get this thing painted. Well, I should say primed, not painted, but just first layer primer.
This is a stage where you want to utilize your filler primer. After you've done a general sand and then put some glazing putty on and then sanded it, you can still see that there are some lines here, but we're going to try to get rid of those and mitigate those with some filler primer. So we're going to do 2 coats, give adequate time in between, and then sand with 320 and see how it looks. So I'm going to hit this with some filler primer and see how it looks.
All right, so faceplate was glazed and sanded with 220 and 320. And then basically I did 2 coats of filler primer, sanded with 320. And then I noticed a couple spots that needed some more glazing. So what I did was basically just knocked them down with 180 and then filled them in with the glazing putty. You can see some of those spots here. They were just too deep that the filler really wouldn't be able to, the primer filler wouldn't be able to fill in. So stripped it off, did some glazing putty, and now what I'm gonna do is hopefully do the last layer of filler primer. It's pretty smooth, it's pretty good, so we're gonna throw some filler primer on and see what we're looking at. Well, if anything, we will do one more sand at 600 and then do a final etching primer, which will ready it for paint. So, but we're gonna get some filler primer on here and see how we're looking.
All right, so here we are with the Mark 50 updates. We've got obviously the helmet and the jaw and whatever else you want to call it, the cheeks and all that, all one piece. And then we got the faceplate. Faceplate's pretty much almost ready for paint. Now I'm gonna reiterate my process and how I get it so smooth, because a lot of people ask. So the first step I do is go around and just do a general cleanup. I kind of get all the debris off of it. So if you've got any blips or any stuff like that in here, like the access PLA, or if you've got supports on here, it all gets built up. So I just do a general sanding, usually about 120, maybe 180 grit, just to clean it up. I do not focus a lot of time on sanding the PLA on here because it just takes way too long. I go immediately to a glazing putty. The reason for this is glazing putty is sanded down very easy, and it's meant to fill in small, minuscule gaps, just like the gaps you have in the lines you have from 3D printing. So I basically went through, did my cleanup sanding, applied the glazing putty, sanded it with 220, looked and seen where else it needed it, put more in, sanded it with 320, did 2 coats of filler primer, sanded it with 400, and then applied etching primer. The reason why I apply etching primer is this. As you sand PLA with a higher and higher grit sandpaper, you are refining it, you're making it smoother. When you make it that smooth, when you apply a regular primer, what can happen is it can actually get absorbed in and not fully dry. And then when you paint it, you get wrinkles. And I'm sure some of you watching this, that's happened to. It feels dry to the touch, you think it's dry, but it gets trapped in little areas, and then you paint it and you just get random wrinkles, and then you gotta start all over. Etching primer, that will not happen with. Etching primer is actually made to work with metal. It's meant for maximum adhesion on any sort of smooth surface. So I really recommend doing the etching primer because that will really help solidify that bond, and obviously adequate dry time after you do the filler primer. So like I said, when I do the 2 coats of filler primer, I'll spray it very light, leave it for about 2 hours, and then spray it again, but then go through and sand it. That way, when you sand it, if it's not dry, you'll see and be like, okay, I gotta strip that off and go over. But I never have any issues with that because, again, you have to give adequate time. My son's in the background playing with his car, so if you hear something, it's not me, it's actually my son. But essentially, this faceplate is pretty much ready for paint. You can see how smooth it is, you can see how great overall it looks. I am going to add one more layer of etching primer just to make sure we have maximum adhesion, and you can see I didn't really get the back part, so I wanted to wait for this to be totally dry. I'm gonna flip it over, hit it with this, and then we'll be good to go. He's really having a ball with his car. Now, I will show you what your print looks like after you've done the glazing putty, but you haven't sanded with filler primer. So this got the 2 coats of filler primer, and you can see how it's pretty smooth, but there's still sanding to do. So what I'll do is I'll go through and knock all this down with some 220 and 320. I may add another layer of filler primer, but it's completely dry. Certain areas in here, it was hard to get the glazing putty in, so sometimes you do have to rely on filler primer, but understand all of this did have the glazing putty on, and you're just gonna have to do what I do and take some sandpaper, fold it up, and get in there by hand. So some of these areas, you can see they cleaned up very well, they're very smooth, and other areas that are intricate, it's just harder to get. But we're trying to not go crazy with the filler primer. We're gonna have to go in here with a razor blade and clean that out because we want to keep all these lines. Back here, obviously, I filled it in, sanded it down, and you can see in the back here all these lines. We're gonna need some additional work. So no two prints are the same. There's gonna be some areas that are just more intricate and harder to get into, and all you have to do is just spend some time. But we're gonna go ahead and sand this, and then I'm gonna show you how it looks. Just so you have an idea, but I wanted to show you, even after doing the glazing putty and the filler primer, what it still looks like. But a lot of these will get knocked down because we have done 2 coats of the filler primer. We were able to fix a lot of that jaw. Remember, this is where the print kind of messed up. So I've been able to reform that with some filler, some body filler. I still have a little bit of more work to do, but I'll get that looking pretty awesome and pretty clean. So we're gonna go ahead and keep sanding this, and I'll show you guys some updates on this helmet and hopefully get this guy ready for some etching primer here shortly, so stay tuned. So here we are after sanding the entire jaw, back, helmet area. Basically, I went back over the whole helmet relatively gingerly with 220, followed up with 320, and then finished with 400, so I did a 3-stage. I probably could have just jumped right from 220 to 400, but I just wanted to be extra safe. I kind of went through and just found any dip or anything that wasn't flush and just kind of knocked it down by hand. You can see some of the areas. I was able to get this cheek realigned and contoured. There's this little piece right here. I'm not sure if I'm gonna leave it. I'm gonna see how it fills with the primer. It's not as bad on this side, but once I get primer on it, I'll get a better look at it. But you can see that the helmet still fits great. I'm trying to do this with one hand here. It's kind of hard. Pops right in. Everything's pretty flush. I was able to get these lines lined up very well. Everything looks very symmetrical. Remember, this was a print that was messed up, so it was only offset by, maybe a centimeter or 2, but that really created a lot of issues when doing this. But I was able to save it, and it looks pretty awesome. It was actually, I paused the print, and what happened is I wasn't using brim on this print, and as the bed plate cooled down, it popped up. So what I had to do is completely lower my bed just to get the print to finish, but when it did that, it created this harsh line all the way over, and I was able to get rid of all of it, but like I said, it created fitment issues. I was able to fix it. I was able to save it. I hate wasting filament, I hate wasting prints, so I spent the time just to go back and fix it and save it, and we'll know how it looks when we get some filler, or I should say some etching primer on there. So I'm going to do one more coat of etching primer on here, and then I'm actually going to do etching primer on here. I was going to do another coat of filler primer, however, I'm just going to do etching primer, and any spots that need to be sanded down, like there's a little spot right here, I'm just going to go over it with 600, level it out, and then re-etch primer it. This helmet's very smooth. There's really not a lot of dips. It's all going to be in like tiny inconspicuous areas. Even back here, this is all very flush. What I actually did too is I went through the whole helmet and I actually filled this in with filler and then went over it with glazing putty. There's another area I'm going to actually knock down real quick. So that way it's all just one piece. I just think it looks way cleaner and way smoother. Again, this Mark 50, that's the first series of the nanotech, where it just pushes the arc reactor and it forms around him. So it's meant to be very sleek and uniform in one solid piece. So I think filling in this gap to make it more symmetrical is going to look a lot cooler when it's all painted and everything all kind of comes together. So yeah, other than a couple spots here and there, which now that I'm out in some natural light, I see a couple spots here that I'm just going to have to sand down. I'm just going to hit it with 320 and then 400. But this thing's almost ready for etch primer. So I'm going to etch primer the back of here, all underneath here, and then do the whole helmet, do another coat on the faceplate. Once the helmet's dry, which etching primer dries, it's pretty much dry to the touch and sandable within an hour or two. I'm going to go through the helmet and see exactly how it looks and if there's any sanding I need to do, which I'm sure there will be, and then just kind of touch sand that up, do another coat of etch primer, and really just the whole thing's getting ready for paint. So I'm going to go get this set up, knock those couple spots down with sandpaper, and then get some etch primer on here and see how it's looking. All right, so this is after the 2 layers of the etching primer, and overall the helmet is very smooth. There's not really a whole lot of defects in it. There's some very light ones around the cheeks. However, I'm not too worried about those because the paint is going to fill that in. When you do this sanding, your surface doesn't necessarily have to be 120%. If you look at, you can see there's some very light like that. See that little divot right there? That's going to get filled in with paint. That little divot there will get filled in with paint. You're going to do a couple layers just of paint that's going to fill all that in, and then when you get to clear coat, it's game over. You're not going to see any of it. So you realistically, you want everything to be around like 95%, which I feel like I've got here. And the paint and the clear coat's just going to fill so much in. Most of the paints that I use here too, for an example, this one, it's paint and primer. So it does have a mild filling ability. So you do, 3 coats of paint and then 3 coats of clear. Even if you wet sand and polish, you're not going to see any of this stuff. So, and we don't want to go too heavy to where we're affecting some of the integrity of, the lines and everything in here, but it will fill it in a little bit. So that's just a recommendation I can give you guys. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to do once over on this helmet, make sure it's good to go. I'm going to start spraying some paint on it. This etching primer's been sitting on here for about 3 hours. It's good to go. I'm going to do a general wipe down. There's, I think, 1 or 2 little spots there. I just have to sand that off. It's just like a little dust bunny or something. But for the most part, hammering this one out pretty fast. So I'm going to just do some touch-ups here and then just laying some paint on it here.